Hello, everybody. Welcome to the week 5 lecture. This week's content is part 2 of the building blocks of literacy. Here we go. Okay, so phonics, we talked about it last week. I would like to say a little bit more about it because, where to begin? Maybe you've heard of sight words, maybe you haven't. I've heard that term used for two different types of words in our language. Little decodable words, like simple cat, hat, sit, those kinds of words. And then the other kinds of words, which are irregular in the sense that you cannot use traditional basic phonics to decode them, but highly frequent in the English language. So what do I mean by that? The longer a word has existed in our language, the less likely the phonics rules will apply to it. Example, the word the, T-H-E. There's no phonics rule that will help a child use the schwa sound, the to pronounce the. Here's another one. Is, I-S, is. Again, no phonics rule that's going to cue a child to use the Z sound with the word is. So if you go and just open up any book that you have or your text threads of people, you will see that and it's frustrating. This is why English is tough. A lot of the more common words that we use do not adhere to the phonics rules. So I posted an article about sight word instruction on Blackboard under week 5. You should check it out. And you can see there are some definite philosophies on how to teach sight words. The bottom line is if we're talking about the non-decodable ones, it is rote memorization. Some children absorb them somewhat magically as you sit in front of books, but some children don't. Children with dyslexia, for example, are unable to do that, and so they have to literally memorize any word that does not adhere to phonics rules, and this is why individuals with dyslexia are, they struggle with spelling. It really makes sense when you think about it. Okay, moving along. Morphology. Okay, so what is a morpheme? We've talked about phonemes, that's the smallest unit of sound. Grapheme is the smallest unit of writing. So a morpheme is the smallest bit of orthography, which is sort of like the letter system in a language, that contains meaning. So, for example, if you had the word bigger, the word big means something, right? But the ER, the suffix at the end of bigger, also contains meaning. It's almost like a mathematical operation. ER equals to a greater extent or more of something, right? So there are two different kinds of morphemes in English, free and bound, right? So a bound morpheme is something that doesn't exist on its own as a word. It always is attached to another unit of meaning. So again, the ER morpheme is a bound morpheme. We don't have a word ER. A free morpheme stands apart. So maybe you would consider something like more, most. Those could be considered free morphemes. Okay, so what's the best way to teach morphology? I recommend teaching it with word groups. Almost teach it like like a mathematical operation, right? So you could give a lesson on the ing suffix and then choose a bunch of words that are action verbs and then add the ing to it. Kick, kicking, jump, jumping. I believe I posted a morphology article to our week 5 folder as well. Now, one thing I will mention is that because English is tricky, morphology and phonology do not always line up. A perfect example of this is the ed suffix for past tense. So do we pronounce that D with a D sound or T, D, or T? It depends on the word. So this is something to think about when you do group words in terms of morphology. That, you know, it's something you can point out and turn into a teachable moment with children and have them do some phonemic awareness and listen for the final sound in the word and see if they can come up with any patterns across the words and identify a rule that might dictate which way the ending sound is pronounced. So, orthography, I've already mentioned it in this presentation, but here it is again. An orthography is a spelling system of a language. So essentially, you can think of orthography as a synonym to spelling. I'm not going to say a whole lot about early writing in this presentation because I do feel like the textbooks are good on this. Be sure to check the textbook reading for this week. I went through, I only assigned the pages that I think are important. There are a couple situations where I did assign an entire chapter, and it's because I flipped through and I thought every page was important. Okay, so letter formation, just a couple things on this. You do not have to wait until a child can grasp a fine writing instrument or writing utensil to teach letter formation. There are so many cool things that I've seen in early childhood classrooms. Sandpaper, tracing, I've seen little sandboxes where you can use a finger to make a letter in the sandbox. I've seen all sorts of cool things. The sky is the limit, so it does not need to wait. The other thing is one thing that it's worth monitoring and modeling correctly is if you see those the letter boards out there, they'll have little arrows and numbers showing exactly how the letter should be formed. And this is research-based, evidence-based, and it has to do with maximizing writing fluency. More on fluency later. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about spelling. I posted a Reading Rockets article to the Week 5 folder about invented spelling. Basically, what happens is if you are doing a good job with phonemic awareness and phonics in your classroom, children will begin using what they know about the sounds of language as they begin to emerge as writers. And so you will see that children will use their phonics rules to make judgments about how a word might be spelled. And if that word is one of those weird exceptions, you may have experienced it yourself as a child. If you've got kind of an old school traditionalist teacher, they might mark up your paper with a red pen or tell you you've done something wrong. But the philosophy on this has shifted quite a bit, I'd say in the last 20 years at least, that our general advice to early childhood educators is to encourage invented spelling. Because the big picture here is that the child is engaging in emergent writing, and we do not ever want to um, shut down the stream of productive language. And this is the exact kind of situation where if they're getting things marked as misspelled and they're trying to write down a story about what happened to them over the weekend, we want to celebrate that and move it along its developmental trajectory. I also wanted to mention the developmental stages of writing or spelling. If you look this up online or look it up in your textbooks, you can find so many different versions of this developmental stages of writing document. I found one that I like the most because I think it is the most practical, and the PDF I found has little examples. And I think this will help you the most for your key assignment where you have to do analysis, observation and analysis of children's writing. And so these are the stages I want you to use in your analysis. I've added the PDF to the key assignment folder, and I know for APA citation it's going to be a little wonky, so I think I'm going to go back in there later and help you with that. And I'll put a suggested APA reference for that PDF document. All right. Yes, fluency. I promised we'd talk more about this. If you are just in a group of people at a dinner party or something and somebody talks about being fluent, what are they usually talking about? They are usually talking about being able to speak a learned language. You know, I'm trying to learn Spanish, but I'm not sure if I'll ever be fluent, you know, something like that. We are going to talk about the literacy definition of fluency, which is a little bit different and more than simply mastering a second or third language. So we're going to talk about reading fluency, and here are some of the characteristics of fluent reading. And we are talking about reading aloud because silent reading, of course, people are more and less fluent at silent reading, but that is very difficult to assess for obvious reasons. So right now I'm just talking about if you have a child read aloud to you, is it accurate? Are they reading the words that are on the page? Are they pronouncing them correctly? Are they decoding them correctly? Is the reading smooth? Is it done with expression? And very closely related, is it done with the correct or natural rhythm of speech, which there's a word for that. It's called prosody. I used to have a teacher always make fun of me for putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. That would be bad prosody. And then speed. Okay, as I'm sure you all know, it's not a race. And that's the problem that, you know, that I have anytime I've been asked to do a reading assessment where the child is aware that the number of words is a factor, and they get really nervous and they psych themselves out and try to read too quickly. So fluent reading, I don't want to say it's fast reading, but it is smooth and automatic enough that the reader's own decoding doesn't get in the way of the big picture. And what I mean is there's something we have called working memory, and it's like a little sketch pad in our prefrontal cortex, and it's where we hold on to what we need to get through a task. And so if you are still trying to decode high frequency words that are decodable, like the word did or the word but, if those have not become automatic to you as a reader and you have to stop and decode them, then any sort of momentum that you've gained from reading, your comprehension of what was in the previous sentence or what was in that sentence up to that point. It gets wiped out because your brain can't hold on to it long enough while the brain is also trying to do phonics. Vocabulary. I've had many professors tell me that vocabulary knowledge is so highly correlated with reading comprehension that they're not even sure they should be divided out and discussed in that way. Vocabulary is so critically important to reading comprehension. And you know this, I'm sure. You yourself may be a bookworm, or you know someone who is a bookworm, and almost always their oral vocabulary, just their spoken vocabulary, is on a different level. And almost without trying, it's just really they are exposed to it. So what does this mean for teachers? You should always model your vocabulary, your varied and interesting and colorful vocabulary when you teach. Don't feel like you need to quote unquote dumb down or censor yourself or only use words that the children might potentially know. That is counterproductive. It would be wonderful if you used a word that they didn't know and you've created a classroom environment where they feel comfortable saying, "Excuse me, what does that word mean?" And then you can model how to look up a word that is previously unknown. Another thing I want to mention, and I've said it before, it's never too soon to expose children to vocabulary. It can happen long before any sort of traditional reading or writing is happening through oral communication, language, vocabulary. You can teach vocabulary in so many different ways. You can teach words in groups by morphology, like we've talked about before. You can teach groups of words that have the same phonics rule, like the silent E words. You can also teach vocabulary thematically, tied to a particular activity center in your classroom or something that's going on in the world that everyone's talking about. Or you can have a particular book that you read at circle time and then choose words from that book to do an activity with. So I've talked about the danger of encouraging children to guess what the next word is that they are reading based on the starting sound or starting letter, but I want to make sure that you're not confusing that with the value of teaching children to guess the meaning of a word through context clues. That's a different deal, and it's a good thing, but I think there are a couple important pieces to that. Yes, it is wonderful to guess what a word might mean through context clues, but then you must model for the children the process of looking up that word and checking your guess to see if it was accurate or not. I cannot tell you how many college students that I teach that will say something to me like, "Yeah, if I see a word I don't know, I just guess what it might mean, I keep going." And it just kind of makes me laugh because unless you're in a timed exam where you're not allowed access to a dictionary, that's just not how life works. Like, you stop and look up the word. Many of us have little computers in our pockets, those smartphones. We have Siri, we have, is it what, Alexa? Yeah, all those fun things. So model for your students, your children, looking up these unknown words, making sense of the dictionary definition, and then going back to the original situation, the original text where they found the word, and contextualizing it and making meaning of that. Okay, getting close to that 20 minutes, but I'm almost done. Comprehension. Volumes and volumes of books have been written on reading comprehension. I can't possibly do it justice in one slide. So I'm just going to do my best like I always do. In terms of the reading-writing connection, in terms of language development, the top, if you view language as these like nesting bowls or categories or umbrellas, the biggest one is pragmatics. And what it comes down to is, can you create language? Can you produce language in a way that can be that makes sense to you? It also makes sense to your listener or your reader. It's the biggest picture of using everything we know about language to send a message and have it received in the way that we meant for it to be received. So that's the expressive side, language side. The receptive side of this is text comprehension. First listening and then reading. So it's more than just being able to apply phonics and decode. I call it decoding plus, because like I said before, when I was talking about fluency and working memory, you have to get past decoding. Reading has to become somewhat automatic and intrinsic. Otherwise, you'll never be able to zoom out and ask yourself, what did I just read? You know, how many times have you been reading a textbook and you get to the end of the paragraph and you've just zoned out and you're just word calling basically, and you go, what in the world did I just read? And you have to go back and do it again. I think of successful reading comprehension as the meeting point between context and content. And that kind of ties to the rhetorical situation that we've talked about before. And of course, the reading-writing connection. Literacy is both things all the time happening. And so you should leverage that in your teaching. Have your children compose texts to make sense of what they've read. Have your children compose texts to demonstrate their comprehension of what they have just read. And then the complaint I get from so many students at Coastal, I can read it and I can understand it, but the second that I close the book, it's gone. Poof, right? How many of you can relate to that? So, retention is pretty difficult because really it's memory, and you can only teach memory to some extent. All you really can do is aid your students with tools to boost their chances for retention. And so here are some post-reading activities that, in my experience, have maximized retention. Have the children do a retell on the spot. Okay, tell me what just happened in that book. Or have them compose a summary. And it doesn't have to be written with words necessarily. You don't have to wait for that skill in order to work on post-reading. It could be images. It could be oral. What happened in what order? And then this is a slightly more complex task, and it assumes that the summary was accurate. A review. Did you like the book we just read? Why or why not? This is an incredibly important critical thinking skill. And then, of course, extension activities, thematic activities that tie to the original text. So one of my favorite children's book is called The Watcher, which is about Jane Goodall and the famous scientist and field researcher. So you could read The Watcher and then do what Jane did in the book, which is to observe and record findings. You just go around the classroom with binoculars, pretend binoculars, and observe and record again through print from writing words or drawing pictures, whatever is developmentally appropriate. Observe and record what happens. Okay, assessment is a whole thing, and I feel like especially the week by week and DAP books cover it well. All I want to say right now is oftentimes if you work for a school or a daycare, assessment is often controlled by administration. But you should always be prepared to make recommendations based on what you know is best. backwards learning design means planning with the end in mind, planning classroom activities, selecting materials while thinking about the big picture of where do I want these children to be within X amount of time. And that's why we use that um, activity-centered template, and we list out the learning outcomes, we list out the behavior objectives with the Bloom verbs. A separate type of assessment is diagnostic. Um, you know where you might want children to be at a certain date in the future, but where are they all at right now? This gives you a good baseline of what can they currently do. And then progress monitoring is any assessment that happens along the way. Now, when you are working with 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, um, there may be situations where you identify that a child is behind developmentally based on standardized measures of development. um, and while on one side of that, you want to allow for individual children to develop at their own rates. No two children are alike. But on the other side of that, you also want to make sure that you help to identify these situations, because there are governmentally funded programs for families with children who are diagnosed with learning disorders, learning delays, and so ignoring that is definitely not the right thing to do. And we'll talk more about this when we get into family literacy. It's just something I wanted to mention. And another acronym that might be useful if you ever hear it, RTI, that's response to intervention. And that's a specific process of identifying individuals who are behind based on typically developing children, and then they are given focused, it's called intervention, but it's like focused instruction that is research based, and then they are monitored more frequently and their growth is measured. And these children are often separated into tiers depending on the extremity of their delay. So those are just some buzzwords that I wanted to mention to you this week.